and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today. One of the lines I use around the studio on a pretty regular basis is members of Congress do not control their lives, as illustrated by the fact that just a few minutes ago, our plans to interview Representative Van Taylor blew up, in large part because he has a duty, and that is to go and vote. So he left the office to go and vote and will not be with us today. So we will cover some other issues, some of which I wanted to cover with him, but I'll certainly cover them with you. And then in the next hour, we're going to be talking with an in-studio guest, John Dwyer. John J. Dwyer has been on the program with us a number of times before. Last time we had him on, we were talking about his book on Oklahoma. This one, entitled Mustang, is really a novel about World War II. It's a series, really, that he has written about, first of all, an individual growing up in the Dust Bowl, but then this individual actually flying planes in World War II, which will get us into a little bit look back at World War II. Last week, of course, we talked about the 75th anniversary of D-Day. Also talked about last week was also the anniversary that would be the 77th anniversary, the Battle of Midway, which gets us into some of these airplanes. And so we'll talk about the military. We're going to also talk about the fact that in this book, they talk about shell shock, which today we call PTSD. And as a professor at SNU up there in Oklahoma, he actually has a number of military veterans that many of whom have dealt with this issue. So we'll talk about that with him as well. And then in the third hour, if you'd like to join us, Karen Pryor will be with us, Karen Swallow Pryor. The book is entitled On Reading Well. We'll talk about some of the great books of the Western world. Yes, there are still individuals that read those books, even though a lot of our liberal professors and certainly a lot of our secular institutions no longer read those great books. These are books that have stood the test of time and are worthy of reading. And in the summer, I just thought it would be a good time to talk about that. And maybe you would crack one of the covers of one of those books. They're usually very easy to get a hold of. You go to Barnes & Noble and go in the section which are actually reserved for students, because they're required to read some of those books. And for a fraction of the original cost of some of those books, you can get a paperback or you can get a Kindle and start reading some of the great works of Western civilization. And so we'll be talking with Karen Swallow Pryor about that as well. Okay, well, if I had Van Taylor with me, one of the articles we've posted on our website is one I just wanted to get his reaction to, but now I think I'll read it in its entirety. It is done by the editors of National Review, called Dan Lipinski, the last pro-life liberal Democrat. And he said, the editors say that Dan is the last of a dying breed. The Illinois congressman is one of only 3 pro-life Democrats in the House. And within the pro-life Democratic caucus, if you can call it a trio, a caucus, they said, Lipinski is the only true liberal. Now, Dan Lipinski has a record of being unwilling to compromise his pro-life principles in order to advance a liberal agenda. He voted for Obamacare in 2009 when it actually included pro-life protections, voted against the final passage in 2010 because it did not. And so very definitely tied to that. But as you might mention, there are 2 other Democrats that are pro-life, but they are a dying breed for lots of reasons. One is Harry Cuellar in Texas. The other is Colin Peterson up in Minnesota. But the fact is that Dan Lipinski is your classic liberal. And I remember conversations I've had with individuals back when I was in graduate school who at the time were starting things like First Things and writing about the Naked Public Square and a number of others, that there were at that time individuals who were liberals who had been against the Vietnam War who still could not understand why liberals weren't pro-life. I mean, if there's anything that would be kind of a liberal idea, it is to protect those individuals who cannot speak for themselves, and that certainly would be the unborn. But nevertheless, that has been one of those interesting ironies that even though you would think the liberal position would be to protect the unborn, because of the incredible influence of Planned Parenthood, the National Abortion Rights League, and others. That has not been the case. So anyway, this article talks about the fact that Dan Lipinski has, as an 8-term congressman, faced an attempt to unseat him back in 2018 by Marie Newman, and now Newman is running again to unseat him. And the Democrats have almost in lockstep decided to come against him. Now, recognize when you have a reliable liberal Democratic vote, you would think that you might just kind of go, well, I'm going to turn a blind eye to the pro-life vote that this individual engages in, because on every other issue, he's about as reliable as he can possibly be. But nope, that is certainly the case. And so this message that the anti-Lipinski campaign is sending, according to the editors of the National Review, is that dissent will not be tolerated and that pro-lifers, even those with moderate views on abortion, are unwelcome in the Democratic Party. He says Newman's last campaign, that's the one running against Dan Lipinski, even carried a whiff of anti-Catholicism to it. She attacked Lipinski, a practicing Catholic, for believing contraception is morally wrong. Newman falsely suggested he wanted to ban that. He's never voted for that, of course. It says something, as the editors say, about the leftward lurch of the Democratic Party, that it has fallen to Speaker Nancy Pelosi, a liberal Democrat from San Francisco, to explain to her colleagues the political peril of purging pro-lifers from the party. As we've said around this table before, when you are depending on Nancy Pelosi or even Joe Biden to bring common sense to the conversation, you are in a very different, almost twilight zone. But nevertheless, this is what she says. This is a direct quote from the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, liberal Democrat from San Francisco. She says, you know what? That's why Donald Trump is president of the United States. The evangelicals and Catholics, the anti-marriage equality and anti-choice, that's how he came to be president, she said in the Washington Post. Everything was trumped literally and figuratively by that. Well, then she goes on to explain this. She said, I grew up Nancy D'Alexandro in Baltimore, Maryland, in Little Italy, in a very devout Catholic family, fiercely patriotic, proud of our town and heritage, and staunchly democratic. Then she says, most of those people, my family, my extended family, are not pro-choice. And so Nancy Pelosi concludes by saying, you think I'm going to kick them out of the Democratic Party? So I thought it was kind of interesting, as the editors say, Nancy Pelosi may not want to kick them out of the Democrat Party for nakedly partisan reasons. All pro-lifers should hope on principle that Lipinski prevails against the campaign to purge the last Democrats who are willing to defend the right to life. As I've said on this program before, you have to go back almost a quarter of a century. Actually, technically, even then, he didn't actually speak. When you had the governor of the state of Pennsylvania, whose now son is the senator from Pennsylvania, Governor Casey, not allowed to speak at the Democratic Party convention simply because he was pro-life. So the purge has been taking place for more than a quarter of a century. Actually, you go back 25 years and you just go to what essentially was a prevention of him. So you'd have to actually go back almost 30 years to a time in which somebody who is pro-life actually was allowed to speak at the Democratic National Convention. And there is a real attempt right now to get rid of the last pro-life liberal Democrat in Congress. We'll be back right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You know, many members of the millennial generation think they're special. At least that is the conclusion of a recent study of college students. One newspaper report on the study put it this way. If you ask a college freshman today who the greatest generation is, they might respond by pointing in a mirror. The study of college students documented young people's unprecedented level of self-infatuation. Psychologist Gene Twenge found that over the last 4 decades of research on college freshmen, there has been a dramatic rise in self-confidence. For example, they describe themselves as above average in academic ability and in their personal lives. The problem is that there is a stark disconnect between their opinions of themselves and their actual ability. She's found that students suffer from what she calls ambition inflation. As their ambition increases, it reaches levels of unrealistic expectations. She has also found in another study that there has been a 30% increase towards narcissism in students since 1979. The changing culture is part of the reason for this dramatic change. She explains our culture used to encourage modesty and humility and not bragging about yourself. If someone did that in the past, we call that person stuck up or conceited. Today, the culture often rewards such attitudes and behavior. I would also argue that social media encourages and accentuates this trend. Students posting pictures of themselves on Facebook and Instagram, uploading videos on YouTube, and leaving numerous comments on Twitter receive positive feedback for such behavior. These technologies provide additional vehicles to feed their narcissism. These studies remind us that this generation needs guidance from pastors and parents so that they can apply biblical principles of success, humility, and self-image. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Anti-Semitism, go to viewpoints.info/antisemitism. Viewpoints.info/antisemitism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, let me just mention that we were going to have Representative Van Taylor with us today. And since he is not, let me quote from another representative in the state of Texas, and that is Representative Michael Cloud. He represents the 27th congressional district in the state of Texas. And whether you live in Texas or you're listening outside of the state of Texas, you should pay attention to this because he is a member of Congress in that particular region, and because of that, he probably more than many people understands what is happening on the border. But he also took the time, since this is within his district, to spend a fairly significant amount of time at the border, and what he found, I think, illustrates the point. Again, I'm just going to quote from Michael Cloud on a couple of points, and first of all, after returning from this trip, he points out that we probably are to the point, finally, of being able to acknowledge that there is a crisis at the border. That might have been easy to maintain until, as he points out, we had 144,000 migrants that came across the border, and they are coming across in 3 months in a row over 100,000 each month. So you can begin to say that for a while was easy to maintain, as this was a trumped up, pun intended, attempt to try to get support for the wall. Now there is a very significant issue going on, and that is when you have a surge of about 100,000 per month, there is simply no way we can even come close to addressing these issues. And so there is, I think, a very deliberate attempt to try to overwhelm the resources that exist at the border. Let me, if I can, quote from Representative Michael Cloud for just a few minutes. In one of the interviews he did, he said, "We visited two sectors, the Rio Grande Valley sector and the Laredo sector. In each of those sectors, 40% to 50% of the agents who are supposed to be on the front lines are essentially doing paperwork. They're sitting in a facility working on computers, filling out data entry as opposed to protecting our borders." And he says the cartels, that would be the drug cartels and the human trafficking cartels, know this and understand this, and it's intentional. He says they're taxing our resources because it opens up avenues for them and all the illicit activity that they make money on. And he says there was an estimate, the cartels, they are estimating, are you ready for these numbers? $80 million a week. The cartels are making $80 million a week off of their illicit activity, while we fund for the sector about $13 million a year. You see that? $18 million a week for the cartels, $13 million a week for that. Now, if you have, maybe let's move to the Laredo section. I've been to Laredo, but it's been a while since I've been there. They have cameras and camera monitoring stations. They have enough cameras when everything's working. But again, not all of them are working. And the point he made is these cameras that we're using right now in the Laredo section are from the 1990s. So he says we're dealing with 20 to 30-year-old technology, while the cartels waste no money in flying drones up to monitor our activity, and they have night vision goggles and all sorts of other things. So this reminds you a little bit, for those of us that are a little bit older, of the TV program Miami Vice, in which they pointed out that the production cost for one episode of the TV program Miami Vice was comparable to the annual budget of the actual Miami Vice squad. So you can see that we have a similar kind of mismatch here, in which the estimates are that those drug cartels, human trafficking cartels, and other illicit activities are making up to $80 million a week, and we're going to actually provide for that sector about $13 million a year. And you can see pretty simply what the problem is. So, again, one of the questions that was posed to Representative Michael Cloud was, well, what can the Department of Homeland Security be doing, especially since you can't seem to get congressional approval for any of this? And he said, well, we need to fix the silent loopholes that have allowed this massive influx. We need to fund our border security. We need the infrastructure. We need the boots on the ground. We need the technology. We need the beds. We need the whole package. But he says, in the meantime, our current environment, unfortunately, it looks like it's not going to happen in the short term. And this is an emergency situation, he says, which requires emergency action. And he said, well, I have sent a letter to Homeland Security and to the president talking about some of the things that could be done with administrative action. And they could train Border Patrol agents to do credible fear interviews. What he means by that is that they're just done in sort of a routine manner, so there's never really any kind of threat. And so as a result, people just know and they learn what to say. I'm seeking asylum, but there's never any further investigation. And so, again, quoting from some of the things that Michael Cloud said, he says, what happens right now? They come, they go through the information law, they get on the docket that's about 800,000 people back, so you're far down in the queue, as they say, or in the line, and their court case might be in a couple years from now, and of course they're never going to show up. So this is kind of the situation you're having to do. And he says, if you think of an immigration judge, it's not a judge like you think with black robes. It doesn't take a legal degree. They need to be trained to do it properly. It could be done. It could take about 2 weeks of training, but again, he's concerned about some of the things that are happening there as well. Now, of course, you can also point out some of the other major threats that we are facing right now. The first, of course, is just you have 800,000 people waiting for a hearing. Most of them long since gone, weren't maybe planning on showing up for a hearing anyway. Even if they planned on it, they're going to have to wait so long that they'll probably be in a place where it would be very inconvenient, to put it mildly, for them to come back and actually do that. So that is the case. And he says the problem is there right now no fear that is being engendered. The migrants are claiming fear, saying that they are fearing persecution when, of course, Representative Michael Cloud says that at least 90% of them really are here just to try to find a job. And so, in a sense, we've got just a whole series of issues that need to take place. Finally, he says, you said the Democrats are offering false compassion on this issue of immigration and border security. And they wanted to know what he meant by that. And he said, well, this is the kind of thing in our culture where lawlessness is compassion in a sense. It's a false assumption. The idea that, well, if you want to uphold the laws of the land, you don't care about people. That's a false compassion. It's not caring for my children to leave them undisciplined. It's not caring for society to have laws that are not followed. We can have a discussion about what law can be and what law should be. We can work to change it and have a rightful context, the decision that's supposed to happen in a republic. But this idea that we throw out the laws of the land or we comport with cartels, worst case too, to allow their illicit activity to have an effect on our neighborhoods. When you think of what's happening at the border, when we truly understand what's happening on the border, it's having a far greater impact on our neighborhoods across this country than what's going on in Afghanistan. But we don't treat the cartels on the southern side of the border, which control the entire southern part of our border, like they're a hostile force. We need to take it seriously. We need to take seriously what's going on, and it's sure that we need to actually take the time to address it. So just a little bit of a perspective from an individual that took the time to go to the border representing the 27th Congressional District in the state of Texas. And again, some very sobering numbers, not the least of which is 800,000 people waiting for a hearing, knowing full well most of them will not show up. $80 million a week being made by the cartels, $13 million a year spent on that area for border security, and technology that is supposed to keep us safe, which was developed in the 1990s. So we're talking about 20 or 30-year-old technology when it's going up against the latest and most expensive technology in the hands of the cartel. And as Representative Michael Cloud points out, when we recognize the threats to those individuals in Afghanistan, we take that hostile threat seriously, yet we have a similar kind of threat in our southern border, and we simply seem to be ignoring it. So just another perspective on that. Come back from the break, I want to talk about a couple of other things. First of all, should we be flying anything other than the American flag at our embassies? Right now, some of the embassies are flying the LGBT flag, and is that even constitutional? And then they decided at Conrad High School to cut off the microphone of the valedictorian. What about those issues and where we go in terms of free speech? So we've got some very important issues we will cover as well this hour. And don't forget, next hour, John J. Dwyer will be in studio as we talk about his new book, Mustang. Talk about the military, talk about veterans, talk about PTSD, even talk about how we can be effective writers and make a difference in our culture. All that coming up right after this.
There is no more dangerous time than when things are going well. Remember Elijah on Mount Carmel? Fire came down. There was no doubt who was God, but what happened next? He went from amazing faith to a time of great fear and depression. Many Christians have been very thankful a certain Democratic candidate for president was not the one to nominate two replacements for the Supreme Court. But as with Elijah, times of great victory are also times of great danger. Moments like this are not the time to take it easy. This is not the time to let our guard down. This is a time to double down on our work in the community, to serve and pray and plan and invest in a better future. This is the time to join Point of View's Truth Team 360 to make sure today's promising gains are not lost tomorrow. Show your commitment to our future by visiting pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. Ask to join the Truth Team. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Let me now take two issues. One is a national issue. The other is a local issue that has maybe national implications. The national issue has to do with the fact that this is Pride Month, and as a result, there have been a number of various ambassadors at certain embassies around the country that want to fly the gay flag or the LGBT flag or the pride flag, whatever you want to call it. We'll call it the pride flag since that's what a lot of people call it. It's the gay pride flag. Now, there is a very good piece that goes into this in some detail by Kevin Williamson, One Flag is Enough, and it goes on for 4 pages, but I'm just going to read the middle part because I think it is more relevant to the conversation I want to have. And that is, he said, this is Pride Month, during which organized homosexuality does its best to remind the nation that some people have non-standard sexual proclivities, that for some reason some people choose to organize both their personal identities and their communities around this fact, and to demand, well, that turns out to be a moving target, as surely is understood by anyone who understands how fast we went from nobody is talking about gay marriage to gay marriage is a constitutional right. And he goes into that in some issue. But he says the topic for the moment in 2019 is whether U.S. embassies around the world will run the rainbow flag or the pride flag up the pole and see who salutes it. Well, the matter was easily resolved because the State Department has a process. As you might imagine, the State Department is responsible for these embassies around the world, also responsible for the kind of message we send to people around the world. And you can begin to think about the kind of contrary message that could be sent, where even a banner is put up, a flag is put up, a statement is made, a press release. So once you understand this has less to do with homosexuality and everything to do with having as best a positive image towards that foreign country from the United States, you understand that that is why, as a result, the State Department made it very clear. And again, quoting from Kevin Williamson, a few ambassadors asked for permission to fly the pride flag, and the State Department declined to grant that permission. Others simply flew the flag on their own authority, acting in accord with the proverbial wisdom that it's easier to beg forgiveness than secure permission. Okay, so now you have, in some embassies, a pride flag being flown in addition to, I don't think any of them are in place of the U.S. flag, but certainly some in addition to are flying. And, of course, you can start figuring out where you put it, because if you don't put it on the sole flagpole, then you put it underneath the American flag, or you hang it and drape it across the banners. I mean, anyway, we won't get into all the details. But here's where the controversy surfaced. NBC News asked the Vice President, Mike Pence, about the situation, and he, as an individual that, first of all, is not necessarily the leading advocate of homosexual rights, to put it mildly, affirmed that he believed the decision to be correct. His argument contained no reference to Scripture, no moral theology, but rather relied on the belief that where U.S. foreign diplomatic outposts are concerned, the only flag that should be flown is one with 50 stars and 13 stripes. Okay? End of discussion. But because Mike Pence is who Mike Pence is, a Christian, an evangelical Christian, a member of the Trump administration, somebody that the cast of Hamilton lectured after they did their performance when he was in the audience, you know where this goes. But let me finish this point, and that is the Trump administration, as Kevin Williamson points out, actually observes Pride Month. There was a tweet that the president put out on that regard. Pence insisted that we're proud to be able to serve every American, but he says, quote, the State Department indicated that on the flagpole of our American embassies that one flag should fly, and that's the American flag, and I support it. End of discussion. Should be. Nope, not exactly. Let's see what we can come up with. Here's just a couple of the banners. I won't go into all of them, but there's an outrage directed at Mike Pence because of all of this. You've got one saying Pence backs the ban. Another one in The Guardian, Pence defends Trump's ban on pride flags at U.S. embassies. Neither of these headlines, as he says, are quite true, inasmuch as pride flags have not been banned categorically. They simply will not be flown from the flagpole designated by the American flag, which is entirely appropriate. But nevertheless, just another kind of word of warning. One flag, I think, is enough, which is the title of Kevin Williamson's piece. Probably not worth talking about it any more than that. Not even going to do a commentary on it, but I just thought I'd mention it because you will see various headlines all looking for a way to vilify, to criticize the vice president, who simply was saying, we have a rule, we have a requirement, and that requirement is that you fly one flag from the flagpole of the United States Embassy, and it's not an Earth Day flag, it's not a pride flag, it's not, even the flag of the country that you're in, it's the flag of the United States of America. I don't know. Can't seem to get any further along than that because, again, there's always got to be special privileges given to the gay and lesbian caucus, and there's a good example of it once again. But let me go on to another issue that has surfaced here, and that is the Dallas Independent School District issued an apology to the Conrad High School valedictorian because she, as she was giving her valedictorian speech, had her microphone cut off when she named a number of black shooting victims at the school's graduation ceremony. This took place 2 weeks ago. The apology comes from the DISD that said, quote, "It's never our intent to censor anyone's freedom of speech. Students have that right." And so the Dallas Independent School District encourages that. Now, what started here, and again, you can get into all the fine details, but apparently there is a script that is usually provided of how the valedictorian is going to address that particular graduation ceremony. It is very clear that Ruha Hagar, who is actually someone who has come here from Iran. By the way, I have a former Muslim coming in studio tomorrow who grew up in Iran when he was young and has now become a Christian and a pastor. But nevertheless, we'll get back to this issue. She then posted on her Twitter post, "My valedictorian speech was cut short because I said the names of black children who'd become victims of police brutality. Our principal signaled for my microphone to be turned off as soon as I said Trayvon Martin and Tamir Rice and played it off as a technical difficulty. Pathetic." Well, okay, whether it was or not, here's kind of how to think about this, because on the one hand, we've talked about this before with Kelly Shackelford. Christian students should have the right, if they're giving a valedictorian speech, to mention the fact that they're a Christian, or maybe even mention God in there. There's nothing that is unconstitutional about that. Students also have the right, if they want to take on any one of these social issues. But I think the point of where there seems to be a reasonable dividing line is this. You are speaking to a captive audience. So it's one thing, for example, let's use a Christian example, for somebody to say, I thank my Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, or, as a Christian, I've learned this. That could be still offensive to some atheists in the room, but it's just an ongoing statement. It doesn't go on. It doesn't beat people over the head. But if a Christian student were then to begin to give a list of all the Christian heroes that he or she had, at that point people say, okay, you've just gone a little bit overboard. Let's take a different example. Let's say that in the speech, an individual maybe was a conservative student. We could take it out of religion entirely. And this individual says, we're going into a world where everybody has told us that global warming is a great threat. And yet I don't believe it, because I think there are many individuals that are saying that our future is very bright. And then he goes through and gives you a list of every scientist that actually denies that global warming is a threat. By the way, that would take a long time, because I've seen some of these signatures where that may be 1,000 names, but we'd say that just goes too far. And the same thing here. If she wants to say, look, we are going into a world where black children are killed in the streets, okay, you got your freedom to say that. We're going to start going through the list, apparently, that she was going to have of all those individuals. Again, we're talking about a captive audience. So what's the solution? I think the solution may be to really start to rethink these valedictorian speeches, because an 18-year-old probably is not going to always be able to figure out what's appropriate as an offhanded statement for a captive audience, and how can that particular speech, sometimes which is given 10 minutes, 15 minutes, or longer, how that's going to be accepted by individuals that don't have the freedom to get up and walk out if they disagree. And that's why I think more and more they might just consider whether or not to say, we honor the valedictorian, we'll give you 3 minutes here to go up and thank your parents, thank any teachers, and then we're going to move on. And, of course, one of the things I've noticed as I've spoken at graduation ceremonies and baccalaureates is when I look out there, they really don't want to hear me. They just want to get their diploma, and the parents and the grandparents want to see their kids get a diploma. And it might be better to just limit the length of some of those speeches. Anyway, that's my thoughts. We'll be back right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes, and in studio with us, and the next hour will be John J. Dwyer as we talk about his book Mustang, and then a little bit later Karen Swallow Pryor as we talk about On Reading Well. So just some great material that we'll be covering over the next couple of hours. And just before I get into my next issue, I thought I might just look back on what I said just a minute ago in terms of graduation and baccalaureate. I remember doing a baccalaureate for Dallas Theological Seminary, no big deal. But I remember years ago I did a baccalaureate for Lake Highlands High School. So that's, if you will, a public school. And I remember that there was all sorts of tension around, what could this guy say? I'd been writing some columns in the Dallas Morning News and things like that. And I don't, frankly, remember too much of what I said, but I do remember something. When I sat down after speaking, I sat down right next to the principal, and I heard this, whew. And I know what it was. He was so fearful of what I might have said, so fearful of how that particular situation could have blown up in his face. He was grateful that I didn't make his life worse. And I don't even know how many public schools now even do a baccalaureate. I know, of course, the seminary does, and I've been to those and actually spoken at those. But there, I think, is a wisdom in recognizing that these formal attempts to try to honor valedictorians are admirable, but all it takes is for a couple of them to say something or do something that then just is embarrassing for the institution, whether it's the school district, whether it's for the parents, whether it's for the faculty, whatever it might be. They might really just want to rethink some of the things because, again, the only credential some of these valedictorians have for this speech is the fact that they were able to get the best grades possible out of the classmates that they have. And there's no guarantee that they have any kind of wisdom or that they have any kind of speaking ability. And as much as they try to constrain some of that by asking them to script out what they're going to say, how many times have we seen them go off script? And whether it's going off script in terms of religious comments or off script in terms of political comments, again, it's a captive audience. It's one thing if you want to go out and hear, I'll take Ben Shapiro on one side or Elizabeth Warren on the other, you go to hear them speak. And you recognize that if you go, they're going to have certain ideas that are going to be expressed. And if you disagree with them, you can even get up and leave. That's not happening at a graduation. And so I think it's wise for them to rethink some of those issues. But one of the issues occurred to me we haven't talked about is the impact of the graduated tariffs on Mexico. Now, you might say, well, that was over the weekend. Yeah, well, Monday on this program, we didn't have power in this building, so we did not do a live show on Monday. Tuesday was the Millennial Roundtable, so all of a sudden it occurred to me, it's Wednesday, and it's worth a mention at least about what happened over the weekend. So permit me, if you would. Gary Bauer put it this way: under the threat of tariffs, the Mexican government reached an agreement with the United States to increase their cooperation to secure the border. And so, again, he gives high praise to the Vice President, Mike Pence, and also to the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo. He says the Mexican government has reportedly agreed to send 6,000 National Guardsmen to their southern border, which is only about 600 miles long. That deployment will go a long way towards at least halting the human wave that is coming from Central America through Mexico and into the United States. But, okay, that's a positive. Mexico already has halted one caravan and has begun to arrest migrants on the Beast. What's the Beast? Well, the Beast is that freight train that runs through Mexico, which they jump onto, and then there's at one point where they jump off and catch another train. Also, Mexico has agreed to hold more Central American asylum seekers in Mexico while we process their cases. And again, Mexico has also agreed to crack down on human smuggling, as well as those financing the caravans. Now, Gary Bauer goes on to say, none of this is carved in stone. Previous Mexican administrations have made promises in the past and never enforced them. Some points of agreement will require approval by the Mexican Congress. That certainly could be derailed as well. But if nothing else, we see the possibility that these graduated tariffs, which everybody was screaming about, actually might have made a difference. And so I just thought I might mention that. Yes, I know this is Wednesday. That all happened over the weekend, but we did not have a live show on Monday because we did not have any power. And so I thought I might get to that real quickly here. Just before we take a break, and then we'll put John Dwyer in studio with us today, let me mention that my commentary is on deep fakes, and that may be a new term for you. I was just over in Europe, and over there has been a discussion, primarily in Austria, but I think there were some other places as well where that took place. I think Belgium even had a deep fake of President Donald Trump, if I remember right. But if you've ever seen what people can do with photos, have you ever seen what you can do with Photoshop or Lightroom? You can change faces, put another person's face on another body. You can add things, delete things, and I've done some of that myself. I had a picture of me in front of the Matterhorn, but it had a crane right next to us. Well, I was just able to eliminate the crane, and you didn't even know there was a housing crane there, as you see the picture of the Matterhorn behind me. Well, again, the technology that we have been able to use in photos has been a lot more primitive when it comes to videos. But Jim Garrity says that, in the past we had, at least in Hollywood, professional technology would make it look like Forrest Gump was shaking hands with John F. Kennedy or talking to Lyndon Johnson. Even then it didn't look perfect, but it looked pretty good. But up until recently, that technology has been outside of the grasp of people outside of Hollywood. No longer. Premiere and some of these others, Final Cut, you're getting a little better at this kind of material. And so as a result, of course, the reason this is surfaced is because of the deep fake video of Nancy Pelosi that was created and passed around on social media, which was not true. So, of course, what you have is a technology that's still somewhat primitive, but in my commentary, I pointed out that Cameron Faulkner, in a very interesting article that came out recently, now says that it's Samsung's Artificial Intelligence Center. They've developed a method that can use a single photo to create a fairly convincing video. I'm going to have to see it to believe it, but okay, if that is the case, then what you're going to start seeing is, if nothing else, individuals that maybe even are caught with a real video saying, well, this is just a deep fake. The video of me is false. Don't believe what you see on video. And if nothing else, I think all of us grew up with the phrase, seeing is believing. I think we're moving into a time where seeing isn't always believing. And so if nothing else, exercise a level of discernment. Let's take a break, but just before we do so, I want to encourage you as we come to the end of our fiscal year. Our fiscal year ends June 30th, and I think our last day of broadcast will be on that Friday. Well, it'd be the 28th. And so as a result, just begin to think right now, we're just literally just about 2 weeks away from that, how you might respond to what we provide here on Point of View. We produce these programs. Of course, my commentary's there on the deep fakes today. There's all sorts of great material. There's videos, there's articles, and of course, there's the insight from not only the members of Congress. Unfortunately, today we didn't have a chance to hear from Representative Van Taylor, but also various book authors and others. And if you value what we provide to you, I hope that you will take the time to visit our website, pointofview.net. You can click on that button. It's a blue button there. It says donate, and that is a way in which you could maybe make a one-time gift. But I'm hoping that some of you might even say, I've been listening to this program for a length of time now, and you really do provide some great, helpful information. I hope some of you will think about clicking on that button that says, join the team, help restore the culture. Join the Truth Team for as little as $1 a day, $30 a month. You can support us on a monthly basis, and we would greatly appreciate that as well. John J. Dwyer is going to be in studio with us. We'll talk about his new book, Mustang, right after this.
Is religious freedom still a cornerstone of the republic, or has it effectively been crushed by the forces of tolerance? America needs Christians to be informed and as unified as possible, applying God's wisdom to civic life. Point of View can be a key part of a successful mission. I believe in America. I believe God wants His best for us. We can face whatever the world throws at us as long as we stand together. If you have not signed on, please do it now. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Set up your monthly gift by clicking the Truth Team 360 picture and then carefully follow the directions. Pointofview.net. By phone, you can give at 1-800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. Or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. Or call us 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me this hour. We're going to spend some time talking about a novel about World War II and how appropriate. Last week was the 75th anniversary of D-Day, and we talked about that significance. Last week was also the anniversary of the Battle of Midway. While we're talking about airplanes, that'd be the 77th anniversary, so we certainly have talked about that. This is going to be an hour where we're also dedicating it to those of you that are veterans, whether you served in World War II or in the Korean War, the Vietnam War, Desert Storm, whatever it might be. That is another theme that comes out of this new book called Mustang, written by our good friend John J. Dwyer. Has been in studio with us before. It is a novel of World War II, and if you will, sort of a little bit of a follow-up to his other wonderful historical fiction about shortgrass. We'll get into that as well. John is a good friend of this ministry, as the author of about 8 books, 3-time winner of the Fort Worth-based National Will Rogers Medallion Award. You might remember the last time we had him in talking about this excellent historical narrative on the Oklahomans, and we'll get into that. You, if you are a Civil War buff, might remember some of his books like Stonewall and Robert E. Lee and others. And this one is a little bit different in that more recently he's been writing about World War II, and that fits very well because he's also an adjunct professor of history and ethics at Southern Nazarene University in Oklahoma City, SNU. I might just mention he's also a graduate of the University of Oklahoma, as well as Dallas Theological Seminary, and joins me now in studio. So, John, just been great to have you around here all these years.
We kind of have been around each other for a few years now, haven't we, brother?
You've gone up to Oklahoma, so I don't get to see you as often. But for just a minute, I might mention the connection you and I had. One of the strongest connections was we produced, and you produced, a Christian newspaper, which I really encourage some of our other listeners to do as well. It was called the Dallas-Fort Worth Heritage, one of the largest Christian newspapers in the country. And I've always said that if you don't like what the newspapers are printing, create your own, and you did.
Well, I did, but with the help of a lot of folks like yourself. I'll never forget, Kerby, when we first started bouncing this idea around in the late 80s, I think, you said, it's amazing. Waco has a Christian newspaper, and Dallas doesn't.
Yes.
So that was kind of the catapult forward.
Well, and one of the other people we mentioned off air was Reg Grant, who has been so instrumental. 4 of my last 5 producers of this program have come from the Media Arts program at Dallas Seminary. So you and I owe a debt of gratitude to Reg Grant at Dallas Seminary, too, don't we?
Well, Reg Grant's kind of my writing mentor. If he's out there listening, he knows there were a couple of times when early on when I was about ready to quit writing, and he encouraged me and said, hey, if you quit writing, you're going to deprive a lot of folks in the Christian community of a blessing. How do you quit with that kind of, conviction?
One of the other people on your board is somebody who was with us last time, Bill Murkison, and columnist for the Dallas Morning News all those years. You used to actually be in the sports department, if I remember right, in the Dallas Times-Herald, which was the now defunct newspaper. So you bring a journalist background, a writing background, and as we get into July, we always emphasize this Christian Writers Conference. And you, even in Oklahoma, have benefited from being around other fellow writers. It's been a way to hone your craft, and for you now as an accomplished writer to hone the craft of other future writers, hasn't it?
Yes, Kerby. And whenever I'm asked, which I often am by wannabe writers, what do I need to do to be a writer? What do I need to do to get a book published? my first and foremost piece of advice is join, belong to, be regular in, and get involved in a local writers group. No matter how many books I ever have published, how many awards, I'm always going to be a faithful attender of my writers group because, fundamentals, ideas, networking. So those of you out there that are trying to get something written and published, ask yourself, am I in a local writers group and am I participating and contributing? If you're not, that needs to be your next step toward getting your book published.
I oftentimes said it's a pronoun problem. It's what do I need to do? No, what do we need to do? Because you actually can benefit a great deal by back and forth. And this particular novel, as well as most of your other novels, come from learning some things. And I might just mention for a minute, as a professor of history and ethics at Southern Nazarene University, you've had a chance to interact with a number of people that are in the military or were more recently. But even looking back to our veterans in World War II, a lot of this just comes from getting to meet people, interviewing people, reading their material, getting their suggestions and ideas. And so if anybody wants to be a good writer, they just need to follow the footsteps that you've been following all these years.
Yes, Kirby, and as I'm sure you would agree with all the great books you've written, write what you know, write what God has put on your heart and given you a passion for, a conviction about. Don't try to figure out where's the market trending or, what is everyone else doing? Let me do the same thing. Write what is on your heart, seek the Holy Spirit, and that's where the power and the passion is best going to come from your writing.
I might just mention we have a link to your website, and it is johnjdwyer.com. And I did not know until I watched one of your videos that grandfather was Dwyer, so that's where that came from. Never knew that before, even though I've known you for years. And there's some videos we want you to watch because this will help fill in the gaps a little bit. And there's some where you had a news organization do an interview with you, and then another one where you just sat in front of a camera and explaining that. But what we need to do is probably get into this new book, Mustang. But before we do, let's mention that your previous book, which was a Medallion Award winner called Shortgrass, kind of is almost like a prequel, isn't it?
It really is, Kirby. And you're a baby boomer, I think, and you'll remember that growing up, World War II was the great unseen presence, right? I mean, we weren't part of it. We didn't see it. It was always talked about, all the movies, all the dads and uncles and everybody. It was this revered family friend that was never quite made it there for dinner, but was always talked about and thought about. So really being raised in a home where, as I think I had a father that was very active in the Pacific Theater in World War II in the Army, but died at a very young age, and then raised by a mother who taught us to love history, to love America, to love its heroes, its patriots. I was just raised, I didn't have much chance. I was inundated with it, with a love of history from the start.
Well, and again, that earlier story takes you kind of to the Dust Bowl and some of that, and helps you understand kind of the formative years of what came to be known as the greatest generation. And the story you tell about your father is my father's story as well, because my father was kind of having trouble seeing out of one eye, and one time when they put up an eye chart, he couldn't even see the E on the eye chart, and he had to figure out a way to eventually figure out a way to fake that and actually get in to serve in the Air Force. Your father had to do essentially the same thing, didn't he?
Yeah, we kind of we grew up with our own Captain Americas, right? People have seen that film, the original film, when the guy just kept trying over and over again. What a concept in this day and time. These guys thought it was so important they could not stand to sit by while other people went and defended their country for them. So even when they had physical infirmities that should have kept them out, they were not to be denied.
Well, we both had fathers that were 4F, but they both found their way into the military by hook or crook. Let's come back and talk about Mustang, and I'm going to take you back to some halftime events at Boomer Sooner event, that is University of Oklahoma, and that's kind of the origin of this book. So we're going to talk about this, and I think you're going to find it fascinating. But also we want to talk about such things as PTSD, or what used to be shell shock, and some of the things that affected even those in the military today. So we'll take a break and come back with more right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You know, many members of the millennial generation think they're special. At least that is the conclusion of a recent study of college students. One newspaper report on the study put it this way: if you ask a college freshman today who the greatest generation is, they might respond by pointing in a mirror. The study of college students documented young people's unprecedented level of self-infatuation. Psychologist Gene Twenge found that over the last 4 decades of research on college freshmen, there has been a dramatic rise in self-confidence. For example, they describe themselves as above average in academic ability and in their personal lives. The problem is that there is a stark disconnect between their opinions of themselves and their actual ability. She's found that students suffer from what she calls ambition inflation. As their ambition increases, it reaches levels of unrealistic expectations. She has also found in another study that there has been a 30% increase towards narcissism in students since 1979. The changing culture is part of the reason for this dramatic change. She explains our culture used to encourage modesty and humility and not bragging about yourself. If someone did that in the past, we called that person stuck up or conceited. Today, the culture often rewards such attitudes and behavior. I would also argue that social media encourages and accentuates this trend. Students posting pictures of themselves on Facebook and Instagram, uploading videos on YouTube, and leaving numerous comments on Twitter receive positive feedback for such behavior. These technologies provide additional vehicles to feed their narcissism. These studies remind us that this generation needs guidance from pastors and parents so that they can apply biblical principles of success, humility, and self-image. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Anti-Semitism, go to viewpoints.info/anti-Semitism. Viewpoints.info/anti-Semitism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
John J. Dwyer in studio with us today. We have a link to his website. Let me just mention that you can order the book there. We also have a link to, of course, you can find it on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, all sorts of places, and I think that will be a great opportunity for you to get this, and I would certainly want you to pass it on to anybody that enjoys history, enjoys the military, and I hope that, if nothing else, as you go to his website, you're available to speak. I think speaking to veterans groups, to libraries, to historical societies, Chamber of Commerce, since you're in the Oklahoma area, I think anybody that's anywhere near kind of the middle part of the United States, you'd be glad to travel and go and speak to them, wouldn't you?
Love doing that, Kerby. And when I come, I don't just bring myself. I always bring, media, PowerPoint with pictures and color, and we show them what we're talking about. In fact, this Saturday, anybody in the Tulsa area, I'm going to be doing a couple of book signings at the 2 Barnes & Noble stores all day this Saturday in Tulsa, and we're going to have the Oklahoma Homeschool Stage Band, which if you close your eyes, you're going to think Glenn Miller has returned to earth. They're going to be in the house at both those Barnes & Nobles this Saturday in Tulsa.
Again, for our people in Oklahoma, I have really enjoyed your book, The Oklahomans, The Story of Oklahoma and Its People. And every time I run across somebody that's from Oklahoma, I grab that book again and say, you got to read this. You have never seen anything like that. You've done such a great job of giving people in the state of Oklahoma their history. But let's talk about the origin of this book. Then it goes back to Oklahoma. You're at halftime, University of Oklahoma. Everybody's milling around. They're going to get drinks and everything. And eventually the whole stadium gets silent because of what? Because this was the origin of this book, isn't it?
That's right, Kirby. And again, encouragement to my fellow writers out there, don't give up. Churchill would say never, never, never. And even more so as a writer. This was 1986, Kirby,
Wow.
30-something years ago.
Yes.
I had not even the twinkling or the glimmer of an eye of a book being published at that point. I was knee-deep in seminary, Dallas Seminary, was back visiting my old alma mater, University of Oklahoma. My brother Paul and I we were sitting at halftime of the game. Don't even remember who the opponent was. And as you said, it was revelry and all. But by the end of this ceremony, you could have heard a pin drop among 80,000 people.
Wow.
What they were doing was inducting, as a lifelong OU fan, I'd never heard of this guy, first consensus All-American ever at the University of Oklahoma, pro football star, Waddy Young. And they were cataloging his athletic exploits and then his legendary deeds in World War II as an aviator.
Yes.
I'll never forget, at the end of it, my brother looked at me. Everybody was just sitting there stunned at this story. My brother said, well, that was a different generation.
Yes.
But that's what started 30-something years ago. Waddy Young is a major character in both Shortgrass and Mustang. He's not the main character. He's the best buddy of the protagonist, the fictional protagonist, Lance Roark.
Yeah.
They're both aviators and flyers in World War II.
We learned a little bit more about Lance, but again, just think about that. 33 years ago, that's a third of a century, the genesis of this book in some respects. And again, let's talk about this because these guys are flying these super fast planes, and they're going against the Luftwaffe. Yeah. And as I mentioned last week when we talked about the Battle of Midway, these guys that are coming in fighting the Japanese with these torpedo planes, almost every one of them are eliminated. I mean, there is one wave and most of them are eliminated. Another wave, most of them eliminated. The few that drop their torpedoes, every single one of those miss those aircraft carriers. The third wave comes in. A few more survive, but not many. And not one of those hit a aircraft carrier with a torpedo. Then on this fourth and final wave, then you have the dive bombers that hit 3 of the 4, sink them. Eventually the fourth sinks as well, and it becomes one of the most significant naval battles in history. Yeah. But again, most of these individuals, most of these aviators died. They did not make it past Midway. By the way, most of those on those aircraft carriers are the ones that actually bombed Pearl Harbor. They didn't have a chance to celebrate the victory at Pearl Harbor for very long. But talk about these individuals because they are fighting the Luftwaffe against individuals that were so much more successful in terms of aviation than the Americans were. True?
Exactly, Kirby, and a shout out to Casey Cowan. He's the guy that was mad and crazy enough to decide to publish these books.
Yes.
Publisher of Ogma Creative Media, Tyree Press is the imprint for Shortgrass and Mustang. Several years ago, he came and spoke. Did I mention earlier the importance of being in a writers group, my fellow writers? The Oklahoma City Writers Group, and here was this publisher from Arkansas, and he said, first thing off the bat, he said, just want to make sure everyone knows we're not accepting unsolicited manuscripts. He goes, I don't want there to be any awkward situations. So he kind of got that out of the way, that they weren't taking manuscripts. Well, after the talk, I go up to him and we realize we have a common literary hero, Herman Wouk, The Winds of War, War and Remembrance.
Oh, sure.
And
yes.
Kirby, I was literally had goosebumps a moment ago when you were telling that story about the torpedo bombers at Midway. And, of course, Midway was the turning point in World War II.
Yes,
I mean, it gets overlooked, but that we were getting our what's kicked until that point. That turned it all the way around. Well, when I read Herman Wouk's depiction of the American patriots and what the price that it took to win at the Battle of Midway, that is what really, I think, engendered in me, and that was even longer ago than 1986, the idea and the passion to tell a World War II story at some point. So turns out Casey Cowan, the publisher, and I, we have a common literary hero, Herman Wouk, and we reference War and Remembrance that took place in, and that led to a publishing contract with, an inspiration, as you kind of alluded to with Mustang. You've got these American aviators that are good old boys off the farm, from the football field, from the shop. Most of them were people of humble means at that point, early 1940s, and they were going against the greatest fighting force in history. I mean, we forget it took 6 years for Russia and all of its satellite nations, all the European nations, the British Empire, the United States, and most of the Western Hemisphere to beat the one country, the Germans. These guys, their aces, aviation aces, had 250, 300 kills per man. So we had guys that were going in that had a couple hundred hours in the air ever. That's what and so what we do with Mustang, Kerby, for your listeners out there, is if you want to get in the cockpit and see what it really was like in the European Air War, the greatest aerial war in history, and the cost and sacrifice it actually took for America to clear the skies so that there could even be a D-Day, which we celebrated last week, so our men would not be massacred on the beaches. It was a precious price that it cost and it took for us to win that battle in the skies. And it hasn't really been told very many times before in the raw way that we've done it. So I think fasten your seatbelt when you climb in the cockpit with Lance and Waddy and the boys, because it's a turbulent ride.
Let's talk about it for just a minute, because this is historical, but it's a historical fiction. So people might say, I'm not familiar with that, although I think you've done a good job of explaining that in the past. And we've talked about Stonewall, and we've talked about Lee and others. So there are historical events in here, but at the same time, you pull together some of the other stories so that you give us a fictional story about one individual, but by following him through that, you have a pretty good idea of what it must have been like to be a World War II ace.
That's right, Kerby. Whether it's my editors, my agent, or my wife, Grace, they're always saying, okay, stop preaching. Don't put too much history in there. You know, they know that it's good to have it, but in a historical drama, a novel, you don't want to exposit too heavily. So, but what I've done is I've found ways to weave it into the narrative. So you're actually, as you go through Mustang and Shortgrass before that, the prequel, you're actually tracking in the background. You're hearing what's going on elsewhere in the world during World War II. And I might add that historical fiction, as you say, you weave in real characters, real events with a fictional protagonist in this case. But also, this is written, as all my works are, from a providential Christian worldview. That means there's some rough edges. It's a rough time. It's a rough war. But it's written in a way where you're not going to be embarrassed if you sit down to read it as a family. I don't know if I'd have a 6-year-old listen in necessarily, but certainly with your children a few years older than that, where you're not going to be embarrassed with the language and things like that. And that takes some doing, as you know, in this day and time when people want to read a rock'em sock'em adventure, war epic. Sometimes they're looking for elements that, as a Christian, I'm not willing to put in there. But it's real, and ultimately it's redemptive. And I think when you read Mustang, there's going to be a while there you're going to think, well, how's this thing possibly going to turn out redemptive? Kind of like our lives, right?
Yeah. Well, again, I just hope that sometime somebody thinks the idea of making it into a film. I mean, remember the Pearl Harbor film and some of those? Just be a great opportunity. But if nothing else, you also just mentioned you have editors. You said before that if you didn't have editors, this thing would be a lot longer. It's 300 pages, just barely. And so as a result, it's quite readable and quite interesting. And if you have young people that are interested in the military, interested in history, you got to get them a copy of this book. And of course, when we come back, we're going to get into some other aspects of that, because as a professor, you've learned that some of the issues in the film are shown up with our military right now. So we'll take a break and be back right after this.
It wasn't long ago, it seemed, every official decision brought religious liberty and our ability to live as faithful Christians into question. Some of us wondered how long it would be before we were literally forced to choose between obeying God or men. That pressure seems to have subsided just a bit, and now is the time not to take a breath, but to work as hard as we can for the future of our nation. Thanks to you, Point of View is doing just that. And our special thanks to those who have become members of Truth Team 360. In football, 22 guys battle it out on the field while 40 or 60,000 watch in the stands, and perhaps hundreds of thousands more watch on television. We need a special few to get out of the seats and into the game. Join today by calling 1-800-347-5151 and ask to join the Truth Team, or visit us online at pointofview.net/team. We really do need you. The nation needs you. 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net/team. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. John J. Dwyer in studio with us. We're talking about his book, Mustang. And just before we get back to the book, let's talk about your website. If people click on the button there at Point of View and scroll down, That will take them to your website. And as they go there, first of all, of course, they can order the book there. They can probably find it in the local bookstore and other places. But you also have media, your bio, and a place to connect. Because if people were interested in maybe having you come and speak, or if they would like to have you do a book signing or speak to a historical society, that's all available too, isn't it?
Absolutely, Kirby. It's just a click away. You go to johnjdwyer.com and you can email me. And I've gotten to where I spend a couple hours a day. You probably do this too, just corresponding with readers and folks that follow what you do and encouraging them. So love to hear from folks and interact, especially if you have an interest in World War II, aviation, the veterans, that sort of thing that Mustang has to do with.
One other topic I want to put on the table before I start taking some phone calls is this idea in the book of shell shock. Today we call it PTSD. Now, as you well know, we've done some programs on PTSD on the military. My commentary last Friday was about the incredibly high suicide rate among farmers, which has caught the CDC off guard, so you can read that. I got two commentaries coming up next week, Monday and Tuesday, dealing with the issue of suicide. It's just something that surfaces more and more, these deaths of despair, the opioid overdoses, suicide, and the rest. Back in World War I and II, we didn't know as much. We called it trench warfare, and in World War I, we talked about it later, shell shock. We now give it the title PTSD. But you've had people that have been in the military read your book that say, well, John, you must have been in the military. And you're going, no, I've not been in the military. But that comes from the teaching that you've done at SNU with some of these military veterans that have come back from Iraq and Afghanistan, right?
That's right, Kirby. Southern Nazarene University in Oklahoma City, where I've taught since 2006, was one of only 13 universities in America that a few years ago the U.S. Department of Education gave grants to establish programs for veteran student success.
Wow.
What that means is, and you'll see this on our website, we have a TV segment and
yes,
other things.
I watched that, yes.
Yeah, it's remarkable. There's a building, and you know, classes I teach at SNU, some of them, 2/3 to 3/4 of some of those classes have been veterans. And we're talking people have been deployed, Iraq, Afghanistan, special ops, some of them multiple deployments over multiple years. So as you said, I've had a couple of military folks, ex-pilots, that have said, you know, how did you make this seem so real in Mustang when you're not a veteran yourself? And it took me a minute before I realized it's my students, Kirby, over the last 15 years, not just in the classroom, but building relationships like I love to do at a Christian university like SNU. You go to coffee with them, they hang around after class. And I mean, I can't even begin to tell you the stories I've heard from honorable men and some women that have lost their families, that got into situations over there where they where there were killings of civilians that were accidental, that they never intended to be a part of, and they had to come back and live with that. Right. One man, a highly decorated Marine sergeant, was over there multiple tours. He told me after the last night of class, he said, I'm trying to figure out what to do. I said, what do you mean? He said, I got all my guys back home safe. I brought my whole squad back, platoon safe. And then last night I found out the fourth one, he was wrapping Christmas presents. He hollered at his wife from the other room, said, any more packages to wrap? She said, no, that's it, honey. He goes, okay. And he went in the bedroom and killed himself. He said, that's my fourth guy I've lost. And that's how they say it. And you vets out there that have commanded soldiers, you know what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. That's your guy. And when a man takes his life, you feel like you've lost him. And so, you know, how do you process that? And some of these pages in Mustang, I feel like wrote themselves. And I have to tell you, I was weeping as I wrote some of these scenes.
I believe it, yeah. And again, this whole idea of PTSD, we now have a name for it, but it's been around for some time. We saw that in the Civil War. We saw it especially in World War I. World War II, again, how many times have we had stories, even over the last couple of weeks, because of leading up to D-Day and then after D-Day, people saying, you know, I asked my grandfather what happened in World War II, and they just never said anything. Or sometimes they'd say, I'll tell you someday. And just before they die, some of them tell these incredible stories, which you tell in this book about what it was like to be in combat, constantly thinking that this is your last day on Earth. And if nothing else, you just write it in such a powerful way But this would be a great encouragement maybe for others to realize, I'm not alone. I went through this in Iraq or in Afghanistan or Saudi Arabia, wherever I might have served. And this is something that people went through in the European theater, in the Pacific theater, but we didn't know how to deal with it back then. And a lot of them simply dealt with it by not talking about it and just stuffing it down and going out there and trying to make a better world for their kids and their grandkids.
Well, that's right, Kirby. And as you and I were talking earlier, the folks listening to this show, are whether you're a veteran or not, you're a participant. And we need to realize that we have veterans around us. When we go to church with them, when we work with them, we have their family members. Maybe it's a wife and the kids come to church, and the dad who's been deployed multiple times, you never see him. We need to realize that if these guys have been deployed, if they've seen combat, they've got internal scars. That's one thing that was a shock to me, Kirby, after teaching these guys for 15 years. I used to think, well, PTSD, some guys come back with that. And it finally hit me. All guys come back with it. If they've been in action, that they have all been touched by it. So I would just encourage our listeners, think about somebody that's a veteran, that's a family member of a veteran, and just reach out to them. It's not like they're a charity case or anything. These are brave men and women, but reach out and be a listening ear, because sometimes their bond is so tight because they're the only ones, the veterans, that can relate to what each other's been through. So we that are non-veterans, we have an opportunity as Christians to step up, to reach out, to be a sounding board sometimes, because a lot of them bring back stories that they haven't totally processed yet.
Yes. Well, again, we'd love to know what you are doing as an individual, as your church, to reach out to the veterans. And so if you'd like to join us, that number, 1-800-351-1212. Let's head to Oklahoma. Carol, I appreciate you giving us a call today. What would you like to add to our conversation?
Well, thank you, Kirby. I just want to say I've followed both of y'all for years. We used to live in Texas, and I used to get the Heritage, and then followed you on the radio all these years, and just really appreciate both of your hearts for ministry and for spreading the good word.
Well, thank you.
I had a question. My dad was in World War II, never talks about it, not something he really ever brings up. I was wanting to get him the Mustang book, but didn't know if I heard you mention Shortgrass was a prequel. Does he need to read Shortgrass before Mustang?
Oh, good question. Shortgrass is the prequel to Mustang, but you do not have to have read that book. In fact, the publisher, the editors, we worked real hard so that if you pick up Mustang and you never even heard of Shortgrass, Mustang's a standalone novel. In fact, what we're finding a lot of people are doing is they're reading Mustang and then they're going back and reading Shortgrass after that because they want to get to know Lance and Waddy and these guys better. So, yeah,
okay.
you can read Shortgrass and Mustang in either order that you want, or just read one of them. You don't have to have read Shortgrass to read Mustang.
Okay, great. And do you know if they're available in the audiobook? Because he doesn't like to read small print very much.
Within 60 days, the publisher just told me that last week. Shortgrass already is you can get that on Audible. I think it's the big one. So Shortgrass, and I might say that Audible version of Shortgrass, I've never heard a better job done. This guy, whoever did it, he actually learned the songs these people had, their Army songs, the alma mater songs at OU and these colleges, the sorority songs. And this guy, when there's lyrics to a song, he sings the melody to it. So Shortgrass is available on Audible, and Mustang will be in a few weeks.
Might just mention,
okay,
too.
great.
Yeah, go. Carol, thank you. I might just mention real quickly before we go to a break that if you click on the button there for Mustang, and then down below it has Shortgrass, if you click there, then it has the audiobook, the paperback, and the Kindle, and all of those. So, yeah, it's a full service. Plus your one on Oklahoma. I would just have to say, if somebody is living in the state of Oklahoma, they would appreciate that. The War Between the States, and, of course, then some of your earlier books as well. So all of that is available, and we have a link to the website, johnjdwyer.com. There's a place where you can see some of the video interviews that were done by news outfits, as well as when you speak in front of the camera and give some of the stories there. So there's audio, video, articles, and the rest. And then there's a contact section. And I would just encourage some of you that maybe have a historical society that you're a part of, or maybe you even have a writers group. We got to get you to this Christian writers group maybe next year and have you hold up some of your books, sell some books, and tell some people how you write these, because we need to encourage the next generation to be good writers. So, again, those are all resources available at our website, pointofview.net, or you can simply just go to johnjdwyer.com and find it there as well. We come back, since I'm talking to a history professor, let's talk about the value of history for just a minute here. Some of your students might say, why do I need to study history? I think we just proved it, but we'll come back and explain that right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. I'll take another phone call real quickly. Won't have a lot of time, but 1-800-351-1212. John J. Dwyer in studio with us talking about Mustang. But before I take another call or two, let's talk about history. You're a professor of history. We have a number of listeners that maybe have been teachers. Maybe they're even social studies teachers. They're listening right now. They're students listening. Let's talk about the value of history, first of all, and the fact that you're thinking about, especially with your next edition, the second edition on the Oklahomans coming out, you're talking about doing some kind of documentary. But how do we get history in the minds and the hearts of young people today? Have you thought about that?
You know, it's fascinating. Jesus went where the people were. He spoke to them in parables and all manner of other ways. Sometimes we wonder, why did he do that? Well, he did it in a way that would reach them where they were, at the well, in the field, in the temple, wherever. So I would say to my fellow teachers, and also some of you who may need to be our fellow teachers that aren't yet, do you have a passion for this sort of stuff? Because first and foremost, that's what's most important. Young people need to see that we older folks have a passion for what we're up there in front of the class talking about.
True.
And when you hear about all that history course, in fact, history's boring. Well, come to one of my classes. And I challenge you to be bored, because if you have a passion and a conviction for it, and that's what young people are looking for, things to be excited about. They're looking for things to have passion for. So I would say put it in a form, tell stories, give them individuals, not facts and figures as much as people of all colors, men, women of different times, that they can get fascinated in and want to emulate in their own lives.
Well, and again, one of the gifts that you have is you're a real good storyteller, and that is a gift you either have or you don't have, but you can cultivate some of that. And it's kind of interesting because I learned this years ago. When you read the Wall Street Journal, they don't start out with facts and figures. They tell you the story about a farmer who's going to go broke. They tell you about a banker that wasn't able to keep the bank running and then uses that to tell the broader story. Well, there's a sense in which, if nothing else, we need to be able to do that as historians, and so that is certainly the case as well. So I would hope that a number of people that are listening today would recognize that all you have to do is personalize it, and even some of these fictional novels are a real good way to illustrate this, even if it isn't the actual person. It tells you the story of their lives, and reading a little bit of this very quickly, you see the eyes open up a little bit more on the part of young people, because they can then relate to a person, relate to a circumstance in a way that they can't relate to facts and figures and just an endless repetition of dates and numbers and things that mean nothing to them whatsoever.
Well, yes, and again, as Christians, we have an extra gear we can go to, that we can shift into, because a lot of my colleagues in historiography that don't have an ultimate hope for this world or the next world, they come off as somewhat jaded, as somewhat negative at times. If you're a Christian, you don't have to sugarcoat that, wow, this is a fallen world. We're all tainted by sin, and there's a lot of messy stuff in history. There's a lot of it in Mustang. But ultimately, there are principles, people, and a future that should fire us up and give us inspiration. And young people are looking for that. They want hope. They want people and ideas they can believe in. And as a Christian, standing in front of a group of people, you have those ideas and people you can pass on to them.
One of the things we're going to be talking about, maybe even tomorrow, is that when you look at the World War II memorial, there is really nothing about God that's mentioned there. And yet, as Jerry Newcomb, who I think will be able to join us tomorrow or sometime in the future, has written about, there has been a real desire to do that. And anybody that listened last week when I read the prayer of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, you know that Bill Federer, you know him pretty well, and others have documented that most presidents used the name God quite a bit, and yet you wouldn't even know that we were a God-fearing nation when you look at the World War II memorial. So I appreciate the fact that you have a book that reminds us that faith was really important for us to win the war in World War II.
Yes, sir. In fact, when you compare, you read Roosevelt's piece, and that was so beautiful that I put it on my Facebook page. I copycatted it from you, but there was two imperfect civilizations fighting against one another, and we did things in that war, as happens in all wars, that we wish hadn't happened.
True.
But no doubt there was one side. Adolf Hitler considered the Christian church and Jesus Christ his greatest enemy, because it was the biggest danger to his idea that Christianity was for losers, that we are men, we're captains of our own salvation and destiny, whereas the humble American patriot and soldier, you've seen these pictures when they're getting ready to go in Midway and Battle of the Bulge, when the company chaplains are leading them in prayer. It was a far different group of people and cause that went to war on the Allied side.
So one more time, let's just mention that you have Shortgrass. Talk about that for just a minute, because even though you don't have to read it, we just heard that a minute ago, it's really helpful. And it gives me an insight, because a generation that grew up and affected by either directly or indirectly by the Great Depression became the greatest generation to go off and fight World War II.
Well, you're right, Kirby. And what's this greatest generation? Well, these are the people that not just won World War II, but they survived a Great Depression that was brought on them by people older than them, parents' generation and so forth. In much of our country, the Southern Plains, Texas, Oklahoma, Colorado, Kansas, other parts of other states, the Dust Bowl. And so that was a horrible catastrophe. So Shortgrass tells a story of a young American farm boy growing up in the midst of all that. Dust Bowl, Great Depression, war burgeoning in other parts of the world. and you see the behind the scenes of what that young generation was going through in the years leading up to, and I think that helped prepare them to shoulder up and step up as young people and take on the burden of World War II. And I might also add that kind of a bonus in Shortgrass is you get through some literary devices to see the behind the scenes, what was going on behind the curtain from an intrigue standpoint, a political standpoint, that led to America becoming involved in that war in the first place.
I might just mention that we were trying to get some people on, but just to run out of time here, that one of them was saying we really just need to be praying for our veterans. And that is certainly something we have done on the National Day of Prayer. We're coming up to the 4th of July. There's another opportunity to acknowledge veterans. Certainly Memorial Day is one of those days, and Veterans Day and those kinds of things. But we really just need to be thinking, as you pointed out, in our individual lives, in our associations, and especially in our churches, what we can do to affirm and to encourage and to support and come alongside some of these individuals that have fought for our freedom.
That's right, Kirby. And if there's an ultimate message of Mustang, it's that, as we've heard many times before, freedom's not free, but it goes beyond the price that was paid in World War II. And that's part of why I picked that war. We all agree that Iraq and Afghanistan and Vietnam, that there was great human damage done psychologically, even to the people that came back and survived. But we kind of always put World War II in a separate category because it was such a, in so many ways, almost a sacred crusade. But what I'm wanting people to know is that the long forgotten, the people that can't speak with their own voices now, and as you said a minute ago, most of them didn't talk about it themselves. I want us in a later generation to know that these guys paid a terrible price to deliver us the freedom and the opportunities and the affluence that we have now.
Well, again, we always like to certainly do what we can to thank those of you that have served in the military, and we will never be able to thank you enough, but that's one of those reasons why I wanted to cover this. And just a week after the D-Day celebration, I thought it was still appropriate, and John, I knew you could come in studio, and so thanks for coming down from Oklahoma. Those of you in Oklahoma, you can go to his book signing, and if you would like to schedule him to come and speak, we have that link on our website. So, John, look forward to the next opportunity. I guess Volume 2 coming out on the Oklahomans, coming out, what, next year?
That's coming out next year if I live long enough to get it out, Kirby.
Well,
if it doesn't kill me first.
That's for the case. So, again, I hope you enjoyed this conversation. And, again, if you'd like to know a little bit more, we have a link on our website, pointofview.net. Stay tuned. We have a lot more to cover, and we will do that right after this.
So you sit down and do your budget, and you look at all your monthly costs and your bills and your income, and it seems like there's never quite enough. You know what would really help? Finding $500 a month to help balance things out. That is the typical savings, $500 a month for a family when you switch to MediShare for your health care. And when it comes to healthcare sharing ministries, MediShare is really the gold standard. It's been around for 25 years and has more than 400,000 members. It's been around so long and grown so much because it works. And whether you're single or married or have kids, this could make sitting down to do a monthly budget a lot more fun. $500 a month can more than cover a car payment or pay back loans, whatever. So join MediShare and go out to dinner to celebrate. Here's the number to call. They are incredibly kind and helpful to talk to. 855-90-BIBLE. That's 855-90-BIBLE. 855-90-BIBLE.
Tired of fake news? Support truth. Join Point of View's Truth Team and bring healing to America. Go to pointofview.net/team. pointofview.net/team or 800-347-5151.
Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
This hour, we're going to spend some time talking about good reading and virtue. I think you're going to really enjoy this conversation. You know, as you come to the summer, sometimes there is a time in which you maybe want to step back and not have to read for your work, although I am privileged to get paid to read books all the time. What a great job that is. But nevertheless, when I was in high school, we actually had a course on the great books of the Western world, and that was always so helpful. But a while back, I realized there were certain ones I'd never read. One was, I thought, well, maybe I'll crack The Great Gatsby and spend some time in that one. And so we're going to spend some time today really encouraging you to read some of those books that maybe you were required to read in high school, but you weren't old enough to really understand their significance. And also try to make a connection between some of the virtues that we can learn in our lives and how those are illustrated by some of these great books. And it all comes in this great book that has been published called On Reading Well. Dr. Karen Swallow Pryor is the author, forward by Leland Ryken, of all people that I certainly have always respected over the years, Finding the Good Life Through Great Books. And she, as you may know, is a professor of English at Liberty University in Lynchburg, Virginia, has her PhD from State University, New York, Buffalo, author of other books that we've talked about in the past. For example, Booked Literature in the Soul of Me, Fierce Convictions, The Extraordinary Life of Hannah More, and also, of course, this book, On Reading Well, Finding the Good Life Through Good Books, and great books. And, of course, she is also a senior fellow, a research fellow, for example, with the Ethics and Religious Liberty Center, as well as a senior fellow with Liberty University Center for Apologetics and Cultural Engagement. And Karen, it's always a delight to have you on the program. Welcome back.
Thank you for having me, Kerby. It's a delight to be back with you.
Let's talk about this idea of virtue for just a minute. One of the quotes that I have in front of me here, reading well is in itself an act of virtue. It's also a habit that cultivates more virtue in return. I use the phrase every once in a while, the need to cultivate public virtue when we talk about politics and political issues. But this word virtue almost is something that has been relegated to the 19th century, maybe with buggy whips. But we still need virtue in the 21st century, don't we?
We sure do. I mean, it definitely is an old-fashioned term that we don't hear talked about enough. And in writing this book, I was hoping to bring it back into the conversation. And it's just most simply, I think, defined as excellence. Excellence, human excellence, and we associate it with moral character. Aristotle defined it as each virtue is something that moderates between two excesses, an excess of an extreme of excess and an extreme of deficiency, and just finding sort of that moderation that the Bible talks about, the reasonableness that we're all capable of in being made in God's image. And so, yeah, in this book, I talk about a number of the classical virtues and connect them to great works of literature.
I might just mention that throughout the book, you actually take on a number of those, a full dozen of these virtues. Some of them are cardinal virtues, some are theological virtues, some are what you might call heavenly virtues. But I think we might also add a disclaimer, because in some respects, when you're talking about this virtue and then you talk about a particular book, sometimes the book itself isn't the example of the virtue. In some respects, the book is an example of what happens when you don't have that virtue. Is that fair?
That's absolutely fair. I mean, often the most interesting literature is the literature that presents the negative example. It's the most interesting to read about. So, for example, you already mentioned The Great Gatsby, and that's the book that I use to talk about the virtue of temperance. And obviously, if anyone knows anything about The Great Gatsby, we know that it's a world that lacks temperance. But we can learn about the importance of temperance and what it really means by reading a book like The Great Gatsby.
Well, let's kind of work our way through that. Again, we have about an hour if you'll give it us that much time. And one of those things is, maybe I'll start with the first one, prudence. And the reason I use that is the history of Tom Jones. Right off the bat, we're talking about the author Henry Fielding and talking about some of those misadventures, I guess would be a good way to say it, some of those excesses. And so we can learn a little bit about this idea of prudence, if nothing else, by learning some of the excesses and some of the problems that come when you don't exercise that virtue.
Yeah, I mean, just like the word virtue itself, I think prudence is one of those old-fashioned words that has actually come to have even some negative connotations, unfortunately. But prudence is just, it's actually called the queen of the virtues. It's considered the first virtue. All of the cardinal virtues are the most important, and of all of those, prudence is considered the first. It's basically applied wisdom. So there's wisdom that's sort of theoretical and, pie in the sky, like if this were how things were in the world, this would be the best course of action. But prudence is takes a more sober, realistic look. I like to call it wisdom on the ground, because sometimes the wisest course of action in the situation we find ourselves in might not be what the textbook calls for or what we would have thought before we were in the situation. And in Fielding's classic 18th century novel, Tom Jones, prudence is actually the central theme of the whole book. This young ne'er-do-well character has to, he's a good-hearted fellow, but he finds himself in a lot of trouble because he lacks prudence and some other virtues. And so the whole novel is it's almost allegorical in his quest to attain this practical wisdom or prudence.
Well, and the other part of that is this idea of satire. And I found that Christians sometimes don't get satire because you have to make, as you say it, a distinguishing ability and making some kind of separation between the narrator's, what you call ironic voice, and the true one. So sometimes satire flies over the head of some of the individuals if they don't have a little bit of that understanding of that particular genre. True?
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And satire is something that is often misunderstood or just simply missed in today's age. Because we confuse it sometimes with just sheer mockery or ridicule. But what we've forgotten, I think, today is that satire in the classical sense actually has a very high moral purpose. Yes. It's not just mocking or ridiculing. It's actually the mockery of vice or foolishness for the purpose of correction. The idea is to correct something that is wrong or foolish or harmful. And so satire always actually has a high moral purpose, and we have to sort of get that before we can really appreciate satire. It was very popular in the 18th century when Fielding was writing. And it's a lot of fun, but we lose the fun if we just have our feelings hurt and don't realize that there's really a moral point that's being made in satire.
Good point. We need to take a break. When we come back, we'll talk about temperance, and we talked about Great Gatsby. How about Justice, A Tale of Two Cities, Charles Dickens, no doubt, and Courage, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain. And so we'll look at some of those cardinal virtues. A little bit later, we'll look at some of the theological virtues and some of the heavenly virtues. And I'm hoping that this particular conversation will cause you to go to your local bookstore and grab one of those classics and read that this summer. So that's one of the reasons we're talking about this book today on Reading Well. Dr. Karen Swallow Pryor with us. We'll continue our conversation with her right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You know, many members of the millennial generation think they're special. At least that is the conclusion of a recent study of college students. One newspaper report on the study put it this way: if you ask a college freshman today who the greatest generation is, they might respond by pointing in a mirror. The study of college students documented young people's unprecedented level of self-infatuation. Psychologist Gene Twenge found that over the last 4 decades of research on college freshmen, there has been a dramatic rise in self-confidence. For example, they describe themselves as above average in academic ability and in their personal lives. The problem is that there is a stark disconnect between their opinions of themselves and their actual ability. She's found that students suffer from what she calls ambition inflation. As their ambition increases, it reaches levels of unrealistic expectations. She has also found in another study that there has been a 30% increase towards narcissism in students since 1979. The changing culture is part of the reason for this dramatic change. She explains our culture used to encourage modesty and humility and not bragging about yourself. If someone did that in the past, we call that person stuck up or conceited. Today, the culture often rewards such attitudes and behavior. I would also argue that social media encourages and accentuates this trend. Students posting pictures of themselves on Facebook and Instagram, uploading videos on YouTube, and leaving numerous comments on Twitter receive positive feedback for such behavior. These technologies provide additional vehicles to feed their narcissism. These studies remind us that this generation needs guidance from pastors and parents so that they can apply biblical principles of success, humility, and self-image. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Anti-Semitism, go to viewpoints.info/antisemitism. Viewpoints.info/antisemitism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Karen Swallow Pryor with us today as we talk about the book On Reading Well, Finding the Good Life Through Great Books. And the second chapter is about temperance and The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. And I think this is one that some people might at least understand because of Benjamin Franklin and others that talk about the fact that temperance is necessary when you learn to shape your desires and have it some kind of proportionality in terms of your ideas. But when you've had, as you talk about in this chapter, conspicuous consumption and all of the excesses, I think as Christians, if nothing else, we should understand that temperance is a virtue that we need to emphasize once again in our 21st century world.
Yes, it's so interesting how these works of literature that are written so long ago actually can parallel almost exactly things that we're dealing with now. I mean, The Great Gatsby was written almost a century ago, at the height of, American prosperity and success, just before the event we know as the Great Depression happened. And it was a time of excess and is focused on a character who lives an excessive lifestyle and lacked temperance. And sometimes we think of temperance because we talk about losing our temper, and we think of it as just a negative thing. But as you pointed out, as Benjamin Franklin talked about, it's not just denying something to ourselves, it's actually having the proper amount of desire, not too little or too much, for the things that we need to sustain us and give us life. And I think we all struggle with that because we if something is good, we want more of it, or we want to just deny it from ourselves completely, which is also not temperance.
This, again, is the value of reading, because sometimes we can see the life of self-destruction in this particular case. We can see the trajectory of where our lives would go. And so these authors, in many cases, have helped us learn a lesson vicariously. And Karen, I've always said I'd rather learn the lesson vicariously if I can rather than experientially. Now, you recognize that there are only certain lessons you can learn by experience. How could you be long-suffering unless you did not suffer? So I understand that. But anytime I say to the Lord, I can learn a lesson vicariously, I'm all up for it, rather than having to learn the way some of these characters in these novels have had to learn it. True?
Oh, absolutely. This is one of the great gifts of literature, is that we can learn so much vicariously. And I think that can actually help us when, if life brings us circumstances where we have to practice these virtues, which is part of, the thesis of this book, is that we actually have already practiced them by reading and learning these things vicariously, so that when the time comes for us to be tested, we have more experience in dealing with them. And I think The Great Gatsby is a great example of that.
Perfect example. Let's talk about justice. And again, many of our listeners probably did read The Tale of Two Cities, maybe under compulsion, but nevertheless did. And that, of course, gets us into justice, but also injustice, the sacrifice of Sidney Carton, and just all sorts of other aspects. We live in a world where we want justice, but this is a reminder of how injustice is sometimes the situation that we find ourselves in.
Yeah, justice is different from all of the other virtues in the book, because all of the other virtues pertain only to our individual character.
Right.
And while justice does have that application, we can be, we could be people who are just or not just. It also has a definition that applies to a community or a society. So there are, communities or nations can be just or unjust. So this is actually a difficult one to kind of write about, because I had to grapple with both individual justice and community justice. But A Tale of Two Cities was actually the perfect novel to examine that in, because it does involve individuals like the great hero, Sidney Carton. But also Dickens was writing about two societies, in France and in his own country of England, that were not just in different ways, but they were really becoming excessively unjust. And I think we struggle with that, in our own nation too, in our history and even in our present day. So there are lots of applications from A Tale of Two Cities that we can make today.
I certainly would agree. One more in the cardinal virtues, and that would be courage, and that is The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn and Mark Twain, Samuel Clemens. Part of the problem is that we have had so many individuals now that have said we don't want to read this because it, of course, deals with slavery. It has words in there we don't like. Maybe you can address that. I'm sure you've had to at Liberty University many times of can we read things we disagree with, look at words and experiences that we disagree with, and I think we can learn a great deal. And I'm always so offended and hurt by individuals that seem to be book banners at various school boards or even in libraries, because these are books that have stood the test of time, and they can teach us lessons even if we don't agree with all the way in which it's being taught.
Well, and of course the irony is that Twain was actually writing a book against slavery and against racism. And of course he portrays racism and slavery in the book in order to expose how evil it is. And so we have to, it's just like the Bible. The Bible contains descriptions of a lot of sin, a lot of waywardness. And sometimes people today who don't know how to read well will say, well, the Bible talks about this and that. Well, yes, it does, but it talks about those sins in order to show us that they are sins and that there is a better way. And I would say, all great literature, and Huckleberry Finn is a great example. It shows us this wickedness and sin so that we can see it as such. And it demonstrates the virtue of courage through a number of the characters, but I think ultimately through the runaway slave Jim, who exhibits very well the virtue of courage.
And again, you have also this idea of Huck Finn trying to kind of figure out Jim's humanity with the teaching of his society. So you kind of feel that struggle of what that meant at the time. So in addition to learning a great deal of the courage of Jim, you also learn a little bit of the struggle that people at that time were addressing. And maybe, if nothing else, some of the debates about slavery and abolition and some of that make a little bit more sense because you can read about that in a novel that, once again, illustrates some of the things that were happening in the culture at the time.
Yes, I mean, this is what we see in Huck. He has what I talk about in the book as a malformed conscience. And so when he's actually facing the decision of whether he should turn in this newfound friend that he has that turns out to be a runaway slave, and he's been taught by his culture that this slave is the property of someone else. And so he struggles within his conscience, and he ends up doing what society has taught him is the wrong thing by not turning in this stolen property, which is, of course, the right thing. And so watching Huck struggle through this is so instructive to us because, all of our societies have moral blind spots, and sometimes we have been taught something is right when it's actually wrong, and we have to struggle through it in a similar way.
Let me just mention that this book is available in your local bookstore, but also we have a link so that you can find it. It is published by Brazos Press, which is a division of Baker Publishing Group, and so you can certainly find it there or even order it, about 260 pages. We also have a link to Karen's website, karenswallowprior.com. You don't have to remember how to spell all of that because we have that there. It has many of her articles, some of her speaking, if you'd like to know where she is speaking, or if you'd like to contact her and maybe have her come and address some of these issues. Perhaps you have a readers group or a writers group, or maybe you would like to encourage some other individuals to learn about that. Maybe you have a Christian school where you would really like to educate some of the teachers and even the parents, which I think sometimes need this as well because we want them to see the value of these great books. You can schedule her to come and speak as well. So we are spending some time today working our way through this book on reading well, finding the good life through great books. And we've already spent some time looking at some of the cardinal virtues of prudence and temperance, justice and courage. When we come back, we'll look at some of the theological virtues, things like faith, hope, and love, and then eventually get into some of the so-called heavenly virtues like chastity and diligence, patience, kindness, and humility. So just some great material. Might mention, in addition to the book, there are also discussion questions. So if this is something you would like to have as a small group conversation, this is something that is ready for that as well. Lots of good footnotes, endnotes, and others. And most importantly, I think a book that will encourage you to read well and to maybe even use this summer as a time to crack open one of those books or put it on your Kindle and begin to read about some of the great ideas and virtues that we need to apply today in our world. Let's take a break. We'll continue our conversation right after this.
So you sit down and do your budget, and you look at all your monthly costs and your bills and your income, and it seems like there's never quite enough. You know what would really help? Finding $500 a month to help balance things out. That is the typical savings, $500 a month for a family when you switch to MediShare for your health care. And when it comes to healthcare sharing ministries, MediShare is really the gold standard. It's been around for 25 years and has more than 400,000 members. It's been around so long and grown so much because it works. And whether you're single or married or have kids, this could make sitting down to do a monthly budget a lot more fun. $500 a month can more than cover a car payment or pay back loans, whatever. So join MediShare and go out to dinner to celebrate. Here's the number to call. They are incredibly kind and helpful to talk to. 855-90-BIBLE. That's 855-90-BIBLE. 855-90-BIBLE.
Tired of fake news? Support truth. Join Point of View's Truth Team and bring healing to America. Go to pointofview.net/team. pointofview.net/team or 800-347-5151.
Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
It's our privilege to have with us today Karen Swallow Pryor. Her book is entitled On Reading Well, Finding the Good Life Through Great Books. We spent some time in the last half hour talking about some of the cardinal virtues. We'll move now to some of the theological virtues. And what I thought was so interesting, Karen, is people may not be familiar with some of these books, but they may be familiar with the movies. The first one, Silence, you use as a way to illustrate faith. That was a film that Martin Scorsese did. I don't know how close it followed the book. Maybe you can speak to that in just a minute. But it certainly challenges those individuals, if they've read the book or seen the film, about what it's like if indeed there is persecution, as there was in places like Japan, and what it's like to live out your Christian faith. So it raises some foundational questions that even believers today in other parts of the world are having to address when they're being persecuted for their faith. Tell us more, if you might.
Yeah, well, and actually you raise a good point that I wanted to just speak to briefly, and that is a lot of people who pick up this book are wondering if they need to read the works of literature that I talk about in these chapters before reading my book. And some people are doing that, but I've actually written the book, I hope, in a way so that people, even people who haven't read these novels, can read what I've written and get something out of it, and then maybe go on to read the novel. But yes, the film that Martin Scorsese made, adapted from the book, is actually a very faithful adaptation. It's a very troubling film about a very troubling novel, because it's about a part of history that in which Christians were severely persecuted, and what it means to have faith and be faithful in such times is a huge question. And I don't think any of us really know how we would respond in the kinds of torturous situations that are portrayed in this book. But I use it, hopefully most of us will never be subject to these kinds of experiences, but we still, as believers, we still have to think about the nature of faith and even the small ways that we can betray our faith every day. And we're all faced with that, even if we are in these amazing circumstances of the 17th century Christians who were tortured by the government.
One of the other chapters is on hope, and that's from The Road. And again, some people may have seen that movie with Viggo Mortensen. But again, this is, kind of a dystopia, an apocalypse. What happens when there is on the horizon so much hopelessness? And again, we talk about faith, hope, and love, which are, of course, these cardinal virtues that are theological virtues as well. And that whole idea of hope is really expounded in a difficult set of circumstances that those principal characters find themselves in.
Yeah, it might, to anyone who's even passingly familiar with Cormac McCarthy's The Road, might think, how could you talk about hope in this really bleak and despairing world? But
yes.
Actually, these characters who've lost almost everything except for their lives still carry on and still pursue this journey, and this father who wants to preserve the life of his son and has to hold out hope for his son and for himself every day. It actually does give us an opportunity to think about what hope really is. And Aquinas defines it as regarding a future hope or a future good that is possible but difficult to obtain. And of course, that's exactly the situation we have in The Road. But it's also, something we all need to find in difficult circumstances, even if they aren't as bad as those in this post-apocalyptic world of The Road.
Yes. Well, and again, choosing hope is virtuous, you say, in the book. And so it's just another way to look at that. So faith, hope, of course, the other one is love. You take, of course, Tolstoy's Death of Ivan Ilyich, and there, again, is an opportunity to look at love, even the idea of agape love. True?
Yes, I mean, if someone picks this up and just sees a chapter on love, they might assume I'm talking about romantic love, but I'm really focusing more on agape love. I talk about the different kinds of love that are addressed in the Bible, and cite C.S. Lewis, who writes a great deal on what he calls the four loves. And this story, again, it's kind of a negative example, at least at first, because it concerns a man who's been very materially and vocationally successful in his life, but as he is dying as a result of an accident, he's just realizing that his whole life has been absent of any of these kinds of loves. And it's a long, short story, so it's not a long read, but it's extremely powerful, and you can even find it online. Of all the works that I cover here, this is probably the one I'm most passionate about. It's just a powerful parable, really, of a man who finds love only at the moment of his death, but it's just very, very powerful and very life-changing if you think about the implications of the story.
And you did mention something in passing. You can find a lot of these online, and Tolstoy would be a good way for somebody who's never read Tolstoy to find that online. It would be a good way to go. But I'm going to keep the train moving down the road because I want to see if we can cover as many as we can. In one section, we looked at cardinal virtues, theological virtues. This last section you call heavenly virtues, and that one is chastity. And, of course, you start with the quote from C.S. Lewis, which I love. Chastity, the most unpopular of the Christian virtues. But take us through this, because, again, when you say things like temperance, that sounds like 19th century. When you say chastity, that really sounds like something that belongs in an age of buggy whips. But chastity is still something very important here in the 21st century.
It is. And, in my own evangelical tradition, the word that tends to be used a lot in talking about sexual ethics is abstinence. And that's really not even the same thing as chastity. Chastity is so much more. It's not just restraining, but it's preserving. So even as I talk about in this chapter, even married couples are called to practice chastity because they are called to be faithful to one another. So chastity is a much more positive way to talk about a biblical sexual ethic than what the term abstinence, which has been around for the past couple of decades. And this is, again, I talk about chastity in terms of a negative example.
Yes.
Ethan Frome by Edith Wharton, which again is another great work that has a wonderful film adaptation, which I highly recommend. And what's interesting in this story is that there is no actual sexual consummation of the relationship, yet it still ends up being just as destructive because there is kind of an emotional and spiritual affair that is just as destructive of the people involved as, a sexual relationship would be. And so that illustrates how chastity involves the whole person, not just our body parts. And the Bible has so much to say about that. And this work, I think, illustrates very well the Bible's teaching on chastity.
Very, very well done. Let's, we can move on to Diligence, Pilgrim's Progress, and, of course, John Bunyan. I could camp out there all day because one of my colleagues just got his doctorate in doing a whole work on John Bunyan. But, again, whether we talk about Christian and his diligence or just the whole progress and really the learning of diligence through both trial and temptation and tribulations, very significant in Pilgrim's Progress.
Yes, I mean, I refer to diligence in the book as the most boring virtue.
Yes.
And, I think it is something that it's a virtue that we don't talk about that much. And I think even if we do talk about diligence, we don't really see it as a virtue. But it really is. I mean, just, again, being faithful, being persistent, being consistent. I just actually tweeted a couple of days ago something that one of the Tony Award winners said about he won his first Tony Award at the age of 73, and he said, and I'm just going to paraphrase it here, but he said something like going slowly or working slowly is the fastest way to success. And that just reminded me of what diligence is. Sometimes we want to do things quickly, but actually just moving steadily, making progress, as we see Christians do in Pilgrim's Progress, overcoming each obstacle as it comes along and not giving up. That's what this story portrays. And of course, it's really an allegory for the Christian life. And I think the virtue it most exemplifies is diligence. Just don't give up. It's persistence. It's sanctification, all of those things. They're not dramatic all the time, although in Pilgrim's Progress we have a lot of drama, but oftentimes it's just keeping one foot in front of the other and keeping on.
We're going to take a break. When we come back, we'll talk about just a few more of those, if you will, heavenly virtues, patience, kindness, and humility. And again, it's all part of this book on reading well, published by our friends at Baker Publishing, finding the good life through great books and just some great material. And again, you don't have to read all these books. You can read this one first, and maybe that will cause you to want to read some of those others. So we'll take a break, come back with more right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Once again, the book is entitled On Reading Well. We've looked at 12 different, or will look at 12 different virtues illustrated by various works. And let's, if we can, focus on the last couple, patience, the whole issue of persuasion by Jane Austen. And you talk about patience as suffering, and we can also talk about this idea of patience and long-suffering and the virtue of patience. That is something that we certainly need today in our fast-paced society. True?
Yeah, absolutely. And we sort of lost that core meaning of the word patience, because it actually literally means suffering, and the virtue of that's why we call someone in a hospital or a patient, because they're someone who is suffering. And the virtue of patience doesn't mean just to suffer, but it means to bear suffering well, which also means, this is the hard part, to be able to suffer without causing other people to suffer needlessly as well. That's something I struggle with, because if things aren't going my way, I generally want the people around me to know it. And so patience, and persuasion, Jane Austen's novel Persuasion has this, centers on a woman. Well, she, by today's standards, she's young, but in Austen's world, she's, considered an old maid. She thinks she has lost her one chance for marriage and love, and thinks she never will get another chance. And so she has accepted this fact, and she has, is just bearing it. And then when she has the chance to love again, not to give everything away, but in Jane Austen, usually the good people end up happily married, and as does Anne Elliot. But this character really demonstrates her habit of bearing suffering well, and does end up reuniting with her lost love.
One of the things that you talk about in terms of kindness, you pull together kind of that collection of short stories by George Sanders, 10th of December, but you make the case, which I think is kind of interesting, kindness isn't natural or nice. Now, everybody that would hear that right now go, wait a minute, kindness is nice. Well, explain that a little bit more.
Yeah, kindness is etymologically related to the word kin. And so in a kind of literal way, kindness is treating others like they are family. And for any of us who are part of families, we know that that's not always about being nice. It's actually about being good to one another, which can sometimes cause pain, or sometimes, there are things that are, in the intimacy of a family circle that are not always nice. But the virtue of kindness is really treating others like they are family, which means, in the case of this short story, the 10th of December, it's a very powerful, raw kind of story, but it involves a character who gives up his death. He was about to commit suicide in order to save someone else's life, and in the course of that, he learns how to let his family care for him. And it's a very powerful, as I said, kind of raw story, but I think a really good one to show what kindness is in the fullness of its meaning.
Sure. And the last one, humility. And of course, we had to have Flannery O'Connor here somewhere, because if nothing else, humility, a very important issue as well.
Yes, and humility is the virtue that's the opposite of the vice of pride. And sometimes we might think humility is completely just sort of effacing ourselves and and putting ourselves down, but it's not. It's more than that. It's really just accurate self-assessment, which means understanding our weaknesses as well as our strengths. And in a Christian understanding, it's knowing who we are before God, which means we're not Him, but we're not worms either. We're made in His image, and He has given us gifts and abilities and situations in which we can serve Him and fulfill our calling, and that does require real humility.
And again, in the last part of your book, you have a discussion set of questions. So talk for just a minute how we can use this, because certainly individuals can read this and benefit from some of your insights into the 12 different virtues. But I do know that there are a fair number of individuals that listen to this program that have Bible fellowships, small groups, maybe they have a reading group or something like that. You've already included discussion questions so that individuals that maybe want to read that chapter or even read that book can come back and have a robust discussion about some of those virtues being elucidated by some of those works of art.
Yes, I mean, I am a professor, so I'm a teacher at heart, and that's really why I wanted to include the discussion questions, because that's how I run my classroom, and in some ways this book is kind of like a miniature course taught by me, and so there are a lot of ways that this book could be used by a book club, or a discussion group that you could just read this book and use the discussion questions, or you could read one chapter of the book along with the work that I study. I've heard of lots of different people using it different ways. If you wanted to actually use this book as a guide for a 12-month study, 1 month devoted to one chapter and each of its works, it could last a long time. So there are a lot of ways that it can be used, and I really hope that it will just really help people who want to read great literature but maybe feel intimidated by it, or already love great literature but want to get more insights into it. I'm hoping it will just serve people in that way.
One of the things I might mention as we go to your website is that if they purchase the book from you as a gift or something like that, you can also receive a download from the artist that actually produced the cover and some of the other material. So talk about that, because it's just a great resource for anybody that would like to get a copy of the book.
Yes, the cover art was done by a really great Christian artist named Ned Bustard, who's in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and the cover design and some of the illustrations inside are downloadable. I think that Baker still has that offer. There's a link there. I'm actually not sure exactly how that works, but they can definitely hook you up. So there are some wonderful original illustrations inside the book, one for each of the chapters, along with the cover art. And it was my way of not only promoting literary art, but supporting the visual arts too, because I think Christians of all people, made by a creator God, should be the ones who allow the arts to flourish in our culture. And we haven't always done that. So this is another way. Yeah.
Well, and again, I love the artistic illustrations there. And so as people see the cover of the book or even see it on our website, they can find out more. And I might just mention before I let you go that we have the link to KarenSwallowPrior.com. And so there's an opportunity for people to hear and find out where you're already going to be speaking, to also schedule you to come and speak for them. And I think that anybody that would like to learn more about literature, maybe even invite you to come and speak to their Christian school or the classic Christian school, would be an opportunity. And I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about the fact that some of our listeners, even this summer, might want to check into Liberty University. So as they go there, they can find out a little bit more about how they can maybe even major in English or major in one of the other majors available there. And that's just a great place to study and learn God's Word, isn't it?
It absolutely is. I'd love to see them there.
Well, again, Karen, thank you so very much for joining us on the program today. The book, one last time, on Reading Well, Finding the Good Life Through Great Books. And it's been great to have you on the program with us today.
It's been great to be with you.
Well, let's take a break, and when we come back tomorrow, we'll get into all sorts of issues in the news that I think you're going to really appreciate. We're going to spend some time talking about the various outreaches that are taking place around us, and so we'll talk about Promise Keepers. We're going to talk about the need to get God back into the public arena, and we'll also talk with a former Muslim who's become a Christian and a pastor and really share some of his story as well. So just a lot to cover tomorrow here on Point of View, so I hope you'll join us then. If you'd like to know a little bit more about what we've talked about today, it's on our website, pointofview.net. I want to thank Andrew and Steve for their help behind the scenes. See you back here tomorrow.
So you sit down and do your budget, and you look at all your monthly costs and your bills and your income, and it seems like there's never quite enough. You know what would really help? Finding $500 a month to help balance things out. That is the typical savings, $500 a month for a family when you switch to MediShare for your health care. And when it comes to healthcare sharing ministries, MediShare is really the gold standard. It's been around for 25 years and has more than 400,000 members. It's been around so long and grown so much because it works. And whether you're single or married or have kids, this could make sitting down to do a monthly budget a lot more fun. $500 a month can more than cover a car payment or pay back loans, whatever. So join MediShare and go out to dinner to celebrate. Here's the number to call. They are incredibly kind and helpful to talk to. 855-90-BIBLE. That's 855-90-BIBLE. 855-90-BIBLE.
Tired of fake news? Support truth. Join Point of View's Truth Team and bring healing to America. Go to pointofview.net/team. pointofview.net/team or 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.